Hello again, looking at this 4750G APU from AMD once again, but I had planned on using this as the case, but the board I wanted to use has not arrived. You need a special half-height mini ITX board to do it, and the idea was to make a very small emulation machine. It's for my own personal use to replace my Raspberry Pi, which does okay. But anyway, as I said, smoke and mirrors, this is empty. So just pretend that it's in there. It's actually over there on the test bench using 16 gig of DDR4, which is what I was going to use for this. 3600 megahertz mobile RAM I had for this, but the board hasn't arrived and the shipment has got lost, and you know, who cares? We're moving on. But I wanted to show this in comparison to pretty much the 4350G, which I did a while back. It got a few bits of negative feedback, mainly due to the fact I was using PAL games, but that's what I got. So I can't say much about that. Once again, I'm using PAL games again. Slightly different selection this time, but I will highlight problems as I go forward. There are still some technical issues regarding emulation, mainly with the N64. Anyway, without further ado, once again I'll start with the oldest, so SNES, Mega Drive, and moving forward. You may notice it says Mario Kart over there. I was planning on showing that, but I ended up doing Perfect Dark instead because it's what I had set up, and it's a better example in terms of how the emulators handle N64 games. Well, less rambling, more gameplay, let's get on with it. First up we have Final Fantasy VI on the SNES, running at 1080p. Well, not technically 1080p, it's just upscaled. Being a pixel game, there's not much to upscale. And shock horror, it runs absolutely fine. GPU is pretty much idling, and so is the CPU. So SNES games aren't going to be an issue here, even the slightly more intense ones. You'll be able to run them as originally intended or better. Sticking with the same era, here's the Mega Drive / Genesis. This is good on Streets of Rage. Running at 60 FPS, this is the NTSC version, which I do own. I showed the Mega 6 cart, which was a mistake, but I do own this version. And as you can see, once again, idling GPU and idling CPU. This is running through RetroArch, so you could probably get some slightly better performance using a dedicated emulator, but as you can see, it doesn't matter because we've got more than enough headroom. Here is one of my favourite games. This is Overboard for the PlayStation, also known as Shipwreckers in America, I believe. It's a simple type of game. Just go around as a little pirate ship, destroying stuff and capturing bases. It's a pretty straightforward game. As you can see in the corner, the internal FPS is in the teens. This is just how the emulator works. Once again, this is RetroArch. But as you can see, we're getting 50 FPS anyway, and the GPU and CPU are pretty much idling. This is running at 8x internal resolution. It has some issues at 16x for whatever reason, but I think that's more RetroArch being weird than anything else. Moving on to the N64, here is Perfect Dark, upscaled to 1080p. As you can see, we're getting the frame rate in the teens, which is how this game runs. Cannot stress that enough. There are ways to improve it, but as it is, that's how it runs. If you use some modified versions and use the American version of the game, you can get a smooth 120 FPS and mouse controls, which is amazing. But really, you should play this with a N64 controller. I'm playing with an Xbox controller here, and it is weird.
There's someone here! Why? Me?
Moving on, here is the Dreamcast. This is Sonic Adventure, running at 1080p using Redream. As you can see, no problems at all. GPU is only running about 15%. CPU is not running even in double digits, it's really low. So no problems at all running this game at 60 FPS. So if you want to play something like Sonic Adventure, or anything on the Dreamcast, this machine is more than capable of doing it.
Hey, I'll play with you some other time.
Now let's move to the PS2. This is the PCSX2 emulator, running at 3 times internal resolution. This is Burnout 3 Takedown. This is the American version because I wanted to show the fact that it does struggle a little bit, because it can run the PAL version at 50 FPS capped, but the American version does struggle a little bit. So at 3 times internal resolution, which is about 1080p, this game is struggling to hold 60 FPS. It's doing okay, but it is struggling. As you can see, the GPU is maxed out. CPU is okay, so the GPU is what's holding this back. So depending on what type of game you want to play, you can play at 1080p on the PS2, just not all games. Moving over to Nintendo, here is Eternal Darkness, and as you can see here, we're getting some slightly odd issues, which isn't uncommon with emulation. But with a few tweak settings, this game runs just fine. It's just one of those games that requires a few tweaks. This is running at, I believe, 4 times internal resolution, which is at 1440p, with anti-aliasing and a few things. And as you can see, it's holding the 50 FPS no problem at all. CPU is not doing a lot of work, and the GPU is running about 65%.
What's wrong with you?
I'm sorry. It's my job, lady. You're the only living relative, and no, we can't check dental records. There's no head. None of this makes sense. There's no sign of intrusion, and there was certainly a lot of force used here. I have never seen anything like this in my 20 years on the force. We have no evidence except for the body.
Moving on to the Wii, so sticking with Nintendo for the time being. This is running at 3 times native, so 1080p. This is Xenoblade Chronicles. In the opening of the game, as you can see, it struggles a little bit. We're only hitting 25 FPS and the GPU is sitting about 60%. So it's doing okay, there's a little bit of headroom here. This game can be modified to run at 60 FPS, but you require the American version. If you have the PAL version, I can only get it to run at 30 FPS, like here. I can't quite get it uncapped to 60. But when you're actually in the game, as you can see, the GPU is running a little lower, and we're getting a smooth, well, as smooth as you can for 30 FPS, which is nicer than what you had to play on the original Wii when you had this game. So there is that. Plus it's got a higher resolution. You might even be able to bump it up to 4 times resolution in the game, because as you can see, there's some headroom here. Now, another one of my favourite games, this is Final Fantasy Tactics for the PSP, running at 1080p. This is the modified version of Final Fantasy Tactics, so it doesn't have slowdown issues. But as you can see, when you do certain attacks, it does drop down into the 30 FPS and 40 FPS, just because of that's what the game does. It's not a limitation of the emulator, that's just a limitation of the game. As you can see, the GPU and CPU are barely doing anything. Moving on to the Xbox 360, this is Ace Combat 6, Fires and Liberation. I've skipped out the Xbox here because it just doesn't really work. Now before, when I tried this, it just crashed out, you couldn't actually get into the game. With the latest version, we can actually get into the game. As you can see, the GPU is running at 100%, and one of the cores on the CPU is running at 100%, so we are just about playable with this APU. We're hitting 30 FPS, which is what this game was capped to anyway, so that's pretty impressive. So for Xbox 360 games, might actually be playable on this system. Just watch out for which games you're trying to play, because not all of them work, and in some cases you might get worse performance than this, and others you might get better. I don't have much experience with Xbox 360 emulation.
You still don't have what it takes for live combat. Get back to training.
Moving on to the PS3. I had some issues with the latest version of this, I don't know why. It would no longer run using Vulkan, which meant the CPU was struggling. You're better off probably using an older version like 0.013, and as you can see we're struggling to get even teens, mid-teens FPS here, for whatever reason. It seems to be the CPU is holding it back, which is where the Vulkan API helped, and the GPU is just idling in this particular instance, so the CPU is having issues. By comparison, here is a 4350G running on the older version. As you can see, we're getting a solid 30 FPS, no problem at all. This is at 720p internal, I might add, which is what this game runs at, so no fiddling around with the settings there. And the GPU is running about 50%, and the CPU is running evenly across all cores, which is great. Might have been able to get 1080p. Don't know why it's not running on the 4750G, but it's more the fact that I think I'm using a newer version of the emulator and it's got some issues. I didn't have time to go back and find which version I was using for this exactly, but yeah, it can run, so don't be discouraged if you have some issues. Well, that's about it really. That covers most of the consoles that I own, at least the main ones. If you have any of the games for those particular consoles I've shown, apart from maybe the PS3 and Xbox 360, this APU can run it just fine. Better than what the 4350G does. So that's great. So if you're thinking about maybe, let's say, just grabbing a Raspberry Pi to run older consoles and stuff, you can certainly go do that, but you will struggle when you get to PlayStation era games. You won't be able to run it to, let's say, 1080p. Whereas if you use even the 4350G, you can get a much better experience, higher internal resolutions, better support for various controllers, that kind of thing, as well as more options. So you can run Dreamcast games, you can run N64 games better, you can obviously run PS2 games and above. So that's great. Of course, the 4750G is a little bit expensive. You're probably better off buying something like the 4350G in terms of price. But if you have to have the absolute best, then this CPU is clearly capable of doing anything you want to do in terms of emulation. The only one that really kind of struggled was the PS2 for whatever reason. That might have just been optimization, and maybe some changes can be made. But it did struggle to hold 60 FPS at 1080p, which is a shame. I've since tried it with a few other games and it seems to be okay. It just depends what game it is. But if you want to go play various older console games on here, go ahead and do it. But as you can see, it's certainly got the grunt to run Xbox 360 and PS3 games. So anything from that era and below. But that's all I really want to say today. So any questions, as always, leave them below. Like, dislike the video, of course. And until next time, thank you for watching, and goodbye.